when I was a young man, beginning the study of theology in my early 20s, actually in my late teenage years, I spent a lot of time struggling with and trying to come to some grasp of the relationship between human freedom and divine power, divine sovereignty. Sort of the question that gives rise to, perhaps the most popular form of this debate would be the Calvinist controversy. Does God choose us, or do we choose God? And how does salvation occur? Does salvation come sheerly by the power of God and God's choice, or does it involve human freedom? So what is the relationship between human freedom and divine power? In fact, I doubt that I've ever taught a course of theology, and I've taught a lot of courses of theology over the years, to different grade levels, in different contexts, in different situations, college students, high school students, parish groups, older groups, well-educated people, not so well-educated people. And I doubt that I've ever taught a course, say a semester-length course, or even a parish course of 4, 5, 6 lectures. I doubt that I've ever taught one where there was any significant interaction with the people where this subject didn't come up in some way. How is God's power and God's knowledge, that God knows everything, that God is eternal, and that He doesn't dwell in time, that He doesn't change with us? How can a being like that, how can a God like that be related to my freedom? Is my freedom real? If God knows all, if God knows me exhaustively, then how could I possibly be free? And so all kinds of questions about human freedom, about God's power, and there are lots of different ways of trying to deal with this. I mean, some ways of dealing with it simply deny human freedom, like in Calvinism, that human beings really aren't free, that ultimately the choice that we make is a choice that is preceded by the choice that God makes as to what choice we will make. And God is the ultimate reason why there are any such choices at all. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have schools of thought like process theology that consider the idea that God is unchanging and eternal and knows everything to be unacceptable. And instead they opt for an understanding of God where God is in process alongside of the world too. I don't anticipate in the few minutes that I have in this video that I'm going to unravel all these problems, but what I did want to do is throw out an idea that I find very helpful and that at least sort of guides my thinking on this particular subject. And this is just one thought of many that are important on this subject, but it's an illustration or a series of illustrations that I think are helpful in beginning to come to terms with what we mean by God's action in relationship to human freedom. And I borrow this series of illustrations from a little book called Faith and Modern Man by Romano Guardini, a Catholic priest in the 20th century, that I enjoy reading after, a very wise, knowledgeable theologian and priest. And he makes the following series of observations. First of all, he thinks about what power means when we talk about God's power. Think about how power is experienced in the world as we experience it. First of all, if I have a large stone or a large object that I want to move, how do I move it? Well, I move it by the exertion of force. I somehow apply force to the object and I move it. It won't do me any good, for example, to try to persuade a rock to move by talking to it. It doesn't have the capacity to listen and to respond. So if I want to move a rock, or if I want to move a large object, I have to figure out how to exert force against it in such a way that it will move. Take a second scenario. Let's say that I want to get a seed to grow. Let's say a seed that will grow into a plant. Let's say I'm planting a garden and I'm planting seeds that should grow into tomatoes, let's say. And so I plant the seeds in the ground and I want them to grow. Do I cause those seeds to grow the same way that I cause the rock to move? Do I push them so that they'll grow? Do I force them to grow? Of course not. We are not able to exert that kind of force on them. Instead, the force that we exert against the seed, if we want to call it that, the kind of power we exert against it, is the power of giving it the things that it needs in order to grow. So I can help the seed grow. I can't force it to grow in the sense that I can't push it like the rock to grow, but I can give it a context in which it will grow. So I can put it in the soil, I can make sure it's good soil, I can make sure it gets, is planted in a place where it'll get good sunlight, I can make sure it gets water and moisture. I can do the things I can spray it for bugs or whatever that might hinder it from growing. So I can do all the things that will encourage and sort of foster the growth of the seed. But it's not going to be by sheer exertion of force on the object. It's going to be by understanding its nature and by encouraging it to grow by providing the things that it needs. Now, thirdly, we can turn to human beings. How do we get human beings to grow or to develop or to mature? We certainly don't do it like with a rock. You can try, you can exert force against a human being, and to some degree you can coerce human behavior. But you don't ultimately, by exerting sheer force against a human being, you usually don't constrain their will. You only get resentment from them, you get hatred from them, if all you do is use power or force against a human being. You have to treat human beings similarly to the way you would treat the plant. You try to give human beings the context and the sources of nourishment and of life that will help them to grow from within. So if we think about God's power in relationship to human beings, God's power is not just his ability to make human beings do what he wants them to do. Of course God could do that. God could make creatures or force creatures to do what he wants them to do. But then, of course, human freedom would be a sham. Human freedom would not be real at all. Human freedom would be this mockery of this internal illusion that we are able to direct our own steps or that we are to make our own choices. Instead, what I would suggest is that our freedom is very real, and that's why we experience it as very real. But the circumstances in which we find ourselves profoundly influence how our choice develops. And so the setting around us or the context in which we find ourselves either nourishes or perhaps hinders the growth of the human person. So if we think about our lives in relationship to God like this, how is God's power exerted against human beings? His power is exerted not just in terms of some pressure pushing against us, but instead God's power moves on human beings through the power of persuasion, through the power of constantly speaking to the human heart, through the creation, through the good news that he brings into the world. As a Christian, I believe this news comes to us, this good news comes to us most supremely in Christ. And so in Jesus, in his life, in his death, his burial, and resurrection, God comes to us with his great power. Christ is God's great power as he comes and meets with us and speaks his word to us in the gentle way that he does through his self-sacrificing life and through his resurrection. He speaks something to us that gently comes into us like the waters that fall from the sky that encourage the growth of the seed. But this is a long process, and it requires patience. It requires a life of patience and reflection and learning and growing. And perhaps movement and growth in ways that we just don't see, that we just don't understand. So I would suggest that when we think about God's power, we put it in this context of God encouraging growth from within, and that God does that profoundly and uniquely, but that we should get away from thinking about God's power in relationship to human beings merely in terms of the exertion of force against us.